Hi, everybody. I am Chris Tebbets, and I am here today with author Sandra Headen to speak about her debut novel, Warrior on the Mound, which came out this year. Hi, Sandra, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Chris.
Maybe you could start this conversation off by just telling us a little bit about the book itself and what it's about.
I enjoyed writing this book. Warrior on the Mound is a historical middle grade novel that takes place 2 years before the start of World War II. Cato Octavius Jones is captain of his Little League baseball team, the Pender County Rangers. Cato's dream is that one day he will pitch for the Kansas City Monarchs, just like his brother Isaac and his father, Daddy Moore. But on a beautiful spring day, at the start of the baseball season, Cato and the Rangers decide to skip school to take a look at a new baseball field that was built for a local white team. But the year is 1939. The baseball field is segregated, and Cato and the Rangers are considered to be trespassing. The white community is outraged. Cato and the Rangers are even accused falsely of vandalism. But several elders in both communities decide that the only way to resolve this conflict without violence is to settle it on the ball field, to settle it with a matchup between the black team, the Pender County Rangers, and the white team, the New Hanover Marlins.
And so after that point, a whole lot more happens in the book. As you, Sandra, know, I love this book. I can't wait for people to discover it. But could you tell us now maybe a little bit about what inspired you to write it in the first place?
Well, Chris, my grandfather inspired me to write this book. I wanted to tell his story, how a determined, strong black man could have been raised in the Jim Crow South. I asked myself, what kind of community, what kind of family would have raised a man that I call fearless? There were several other influences that inspired me. One was a wonderful picture book that I discovered called We Are the Ship. It is written by a painter and author named Kadir Nelson. In that book, I learned about the history of Negro League baseball, and I saw many wonderful paintings of African American men playing baseball from the 1800s all the way to the 1950s. That book made me start doing research on just what role African Americans played in the game of baseball. And I discovered Octavius Valentine Cato. He was a high school principal, a social activist, and an amateur baseball player. He lived in Philadelphia in the 1860s and 70s. His team, the Philadelphia Pythians, in the age of segregated baseball, were always challenging white teams to play against them. I admired this character, this person, and I named my main character in Warrior on the Mound after him, Cato Octavius Jones. Finally, Ken Burns' documentaries on Major League Baseball and Negro League Baseball inspired me to write this book. After I watched them, I was truly in love with the game of baseball.
Let's talk a little bit about the setting for this book as well. I know from talking to you before that the setting was at least partially inspired by your grandparents' house. And I also know from reading the book that your love of food spoke to my love of food. There was a lot of food in here, and I was just curious if you could speak to all of that a little bit.
Well, Chris, I wanted my readers to learn more about the foods that a Black family who lived near the coast of North Carolina would enjoy. Um, and I wanted them to learn more about what I ate when I went to my grandparents' home. Most of it was basic Southern cuisine. For example, for breakfast, we had grits and eggs. But when I went to my grandparents' house, we had fatback. And that's a little bit like bacon, except all you eat is the fat. There were other foods that I had at my grandparents'. For dinner, for instance, sometimes we had collard greens, okra. My grandmother would make cornbread. My grandfather also had a garden outside, and I loved to help him collect vegetables from the garden. It was a great time for us to talk, and I learned a lot about gardening and learned a lot about my grandfather's life. But where Warrior on the Mound is concerned, biscuits was the food that stood out. Cato ate biscuits, often slathered with molasses for breakfast, for snacks, for dinner. Molasses biscuits reminded Cato of his deceased father, Daddy Mo. Biscuits made a great impression on me at my grandparents' house because there were so many of them. Every morning, my grandmother got up and cooked a huge batch of biscuits, sometimes 48 or more. I was much older before I thought about why that might be the case. Even when my mother, my brother, and myself were not visiting my grandparents, there were 8 people who lived in the house. If there were biscuits around all the time, no one would ever grow hungry. But I decided that the food at my grandparents' house had an emotional connection for me. At the home where I grew up, there were 4 people sitting around the table at every meal. But at my grandparents' house, I ate at a huge table with a large and loving family, and that had a lasting impression on me.
So there's a lot of baseball in this book, of course. In Warrior on the Mound, the Pender County Rangers and the New Hanover Marlins play quite a few games, in fact. And your main character, Cato Jones, who's a pitcher, even gets lessons on how to throw a slider and a curveball. How did you get sort of nail down the details on scenes like this, on the baseball scenes?
Well, Chris, I was very surprised to find out how comfortable I was writing scenes about playing baseball. But once I decided that my novel was about baseball, I just immersed myself in the game completely.
Mm.
The first thing I did was to watch Ken Burns' documentaries about baseball, about Major League Baseball and Negro League Baseball. And as I said before, I simply fell in love with the game. The next thing I did was to read middle grade and young adult novels about young people who were playing baseball. Those novels encouraged me in a way because not a single one was about an African American boy who was playing baseball. That told me that I really needed to write Warrior on the Mound, and I was very encouraged. I also, the third thing that I did was to watch baseball many seasons. When I watched baseball, one of my favorite things to do was to pick out individual players as my favorites, and the players I picked out played the same positions as the characters in Warrior on the Mound. My favorite players were pitchers, like Cato Jones, catchers, like Cato's best friend Mason, and shortstops, like Skeeter. Skeeter was the character in the book that made everybody laugh. While watching baseball, I also had my favorite teams. The San Francisco Giants were my favorites, the Philadelphia Phillies, the New York Yankees, and the LA Dodgers. And to my amazement, Warrior on the Mound is published in the year 2024. And in 2024, the 2 teams that appear together in the World Series are the New York Yankees and the LA Dodgers.
And in fact, we are mid-series as you and I speak right now. So with two of your
Yes.
favorite teams in line for the title, who are you rooting for?
Well, to be honest, when the games first started, I was rooting for both of them. But now the Dodgers are ahead, and I'll be quite comfortable if they win the series.
So thinking about your readers and the experience that they're going to have reading this book, what would you like them to remember, or how would you like them to feel when they're done reading Warrior on the Mound?
I would like for my readers to understand that players from the Negro Leagues were as good or better than many players from major league teams. We know that from the California Winter Leagues. In an age of segregated baseball, black and white players could go to California and compete against each other in baseball games. And what we found out was that many of the black players demonstrated that they were best. Um, we also know that one wonderful thing that has happened is that in the year 2020, Major League Baseball has started incorporating the accomplishments of players from the Negro Leagues into Major League Baseball statistics. And that is at least a step toward justice. I also want my readers to remember some of the names of players from the Negro Leagues and to honor them. In Warrior on the Mound, there are a number of players from the Negro Leagues featured. For example, there is Satchel Paige, the pitcher for the Kansas City Monarchs. There's Buck O'Neill, second baseman for the Kansas City Monarch, and Josh Gibson, who is arguably the best hitter in the history of baseball.
And lastly, before we hear a little bit from the book itself, are you working on something new these days?
Yes, I am, Chris. My new book is a historical middle grade novel. It's titled Roy and Me and the Double V. In the early years of World War II, the Pittsburgh Courier, which was a newspaper that was widely distributed among African Americans, it sponsored the Double V campaign. This was a movement that explained how African Americans felt about the war in the early months. Basically, African Americans wanted the government to establish racial equality at home before asking its citizens to fight for democracy and freedom abroad. Our story begins when the North Carolina shipyard moves to Wilmington for the purpose of setting up a factory to build cargo ships for America and its allies. In addition to building those ships, the factory must also hire new workers to build them and build houses for those workers to live in. Our main characters in the story are 12-year-old Marvel Zander, an Olympic hopeful, and her best friend Roy, and an aspiring journalist. Roy and Marvel live in a neighborhood near the shipyard. Their lives are upended when the shipyard begins building houses in the middle of their community. They are forced to stop the shipyard from destroying the community victory garden and the girls' running track. Without the victory garden, the community can never survive the food scarcity that comes with every war. Without the running track, Marvel will never realize her dream of one day winning a gold medal at the Olympic Games.
And finally, you've promised us a little sample of Warrior on the Mound. So if you take it away whenever you're ready.
All right, Chapter 19, Rebel Yell. Freight Train is up next. He's gotten 2 hits off me and scored a run in the third inning. I want to strike him out so bad I can taste it. I raise my glove to my face, aiming to rattle Freight Train by staring at him long and hard. Must have forgotten who he is. Now he's staring back at me, his mouth turned down in a frown. I close my eyes for a moment, trying to call up all the inspiration that I can from Daddy Mo, Papa V, Isaac, Rev, Billy Dan, and every other colored man I admire. That's what I'll need if my new windup is going to help my pitching the way I want it to. I take in a deep breath, raise my left leg high in the air, lean back slightly, then lunge forward, letting the baseball fly out of my hands. It lands with a thunk in Mason's glove, just where I want it. Strike! The umpire yells. Freight Train's forehead wrinkles. His eyes widen. He lowers his bat and turns to look at Mason. When he faces me again, I see fire in Freight Train's eyes. He raises his bat again. I take in a deep breath. Gonna put him away for sure. I lift my leg even higher than before and release the baseball as hard as I can. Again, I hear that satisfying thunk as the baseball lands in Mason's glove. Strike! The umpire yells. 2 strikes. Freight Train's face is racked with anger. This time, instead of looking at Mason, he nods at the boys in red. Then he plants his feet in position again, gripping his bat even tighter. I smile inside, careful not to let Freight Train see satisfaction on my face. I wind up again, this time raising my left leg almost up to my cheekbone and throw another fastball right into Mason's glove. Strike 3, the umpire yells. No one is surprised when Freight Train throws his bat to the ground and stalks off the field. The boys in red bang the bricks that they brought with them against the bleachers, showing that they don't like just what just happened. I get a queasy feeling in my stomach. What are these fellas going to do next if they don't like something?
Mm. Sandra Headen, thank you for the conversation and good luck with this wonderful book.
Thank you so much, Chris.